There have been a ton of quarterback battles this offseason, but I don't think there's a single competition less inspiring than the Las Vegas Raiders. Gardner Minshew versus Aidan O'Connell.
Oh, brother!
Yeah, it's really not great. But Antonio Pierce has made his decision on the starter, and it's gonna be Gardner Minshew. Minshew is by far the most experienced and probably the best of the bunch. Now, unfortunately, it's not like the offense around them is gonna be too good either. It's looking like it's about to be a long year in Las Vegas. Last season, quarterback was a major issue for the Raiders. They did still have Jimmy Garoppolo on the roster, but he didn't play well at all. He ended up playing in 7 games and only had 7 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. For most of his career, Garoppolo was the not-so-talented quarterback who was the safe pick. If Garoppolo was out there throwing interceptions, there's really no benefit to having him on the team. So it ended up being Aidan O'Connell starting most of the year. He was a 4th-round rookie out of Purdue and ended up playing in 11 games. Now, it wasn't anything special, but he was better than Jimmy G at least. He had 12 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. AOC came back this offseason, definitely with the chance to be the starter, but it sounds like he'll be the backup to Gardner Minshew. Minshew was basically the Colts starter last season. He wasn't actually supposed to be, but if you remember, Anthony Richardson got hurt after 4 games, and Minshew ended up playing the rest of the year. And honestly, he really wasn't that bad. He did only throw 15 touchdowns. I mean, you'd like to see him have a little bit more, but he did also rush for 3 touchdowns and then threw 9 picks. Again, nothing insane, but he was solid. We saw him start some games for the Eagles, but really for a minute there, he looked like he was going to be the guy for the Jaguars. He ended up throwing 21 touchdowns and only 6 interceptions back in 2019 as a rookie, but he went 1-7 starting the next year, and the Jags surely weren't going to pass up the opportunity to draft Trevor Lawrence. It was really cool to see him have another chance to start last season, and we'll get to see him again this season now. Those are really the 2 names to know. As for the other passers on the team right now, there's also Carter Bradley. He's an undrafted guy out of South Alabama, and honestly, I don't even know if he makes the roster. And then finally, the legend, Nathan Peterman. I'll never forget that September day when Nathan Peterman had a 0 passer rating and got benched for rookie Josh Allen. I mean, man, he was bad. It was a pretty rough stint, but somehow he stuck around in the league. After Buffalo, he was with the Raiders and then the Bears, who he even started a game for in 2022. Then he was with the Saints for most of the offseason, and after he was released, he signed back with the Raiders and is probably fighting for that 3rd spot, I'd assume. I've said it on the channel before, but I'll say it again. I just love Gardner Minshew. Minshew Mania feels like it was forever ago now, but I was locked into that shit. Minshew's Uncle Rico bit was super funny, and who could hate that mustache? I remember watching him back in 2019 and thinking that this is the dude for Jacksonville. Of course, that didn't end up working out, and now Jacksonville probably does have their guy of the future in Trevor Lawrence. But now Minshew is getting another shot to start in the NFL again this year, and it really just feels like this guy won't go away. He's still kicking in the NFL and getting starting opportunities. Last year was a bit of a fluke in Indianapolis, but this year certainly isn't. He earned this spot, even if it was just beating out Aidan O'Connell. Minshew is just a great personality to have on your team, but as for quarterback, I'd be lying if I said that he's the ideal starter. Minshew is fun as hell to watch, and he was solid last year, but I don't know if that's going to be the exact same case this year. And as for Aidan O'Connell, I'll be honest here, there really hasn't been a moment in his career so far that's wowed me. Granted, he's only played in 11 games, but still, I feel like I already know what the Raiders are going to get out of Aidan O'Connell. I remember covering him back in the 2023 NFL draft when he was coming into the league, and there's a reason that this guy went in the 4th round. He's not the most athletic guy. He's going to be a pure pocket passer for the most part. He has a good but not great arm. Like, he's not going to be able to sling it 60 yards down the field every play, but he does have good anticipation and is accurate. So there are plenty of pros and cons to his game, but at this point, even though Aidan O'Connell might have a little bit more experience in this system from playing with the Raiders last year, I still think that Minshew is the better choice. I do think Aidan O'Connell can play quarterback in this league. I mean, the Raiders were 500 with him in games that he started, but I think Minshew is just more experienced, and probably at this point, he's better. Now, could he just come out there and suck it up? Absolutely. And if that happens, roll out Aidan O'Connell. Let's see what happens. But until that happens, Minshew's probably the best pick for the job. With Minshew behind center, or even if O'Connell does eventually get some playtime, the real wonder is just how good the Raiders could actually be. They're mostly viewed as a pretty bad team, but when you look back, that roster did go 8-9. The real mess was really just another shot for Josh McDaniels that didn't go well for him. He flopped again just like he did in Denver and got fired after the Raiders started 3-5. But then Antonio Pierce took over and he had the guys playing hard. They finished 5-4, and if you remember, they beat the ever-living shit out of the Chargers in primetime. They won 63-21 and were up 63-7 late and even led 42-0 at the half. I mean, it was just nuts. And not to mention, they were coming off of a 3-0 loss 4 days before. The Raiders were playing hard for Pierce, and he was only the interim. Only 2 years ago, he resigned from Arizona State during a recruiting violation investigation, and now he's already an NFL head coach. Just a crazy career arc. And frankly, it probably would have been a huge mistake if the Raiders didn't make him the head coach. So now he gets to do it for real. He's a defensive-minded guy after he was an NFL linebacker, and his defensive coordinator is going to be Patrick Graham. He's going into year 3 in Vegas, so Pierce kept him around. And Graham has a lot of much-needed experience. He was the Giants and Dolphins DC previously, and spent a ton of time coaching under Bill Belichick on the Patriots. Then you gotta look over at the offensive side of the ball, which is going to be called by Luke Getsy. No longer the most hated man in Chicago, Getsy now finds himself as the Raiders' new offensive coordinator. He got plenty of hate for his play design and usage of Justin Fields with the Bears, but before that, he was a longtime Packers guy and got to coach Aaron Rodgers. I will say it will be interesting to see how everything goes for him. Now, obviously, the Raiders couldn't have let Antonio Pierce walk after last season, and there's a lot of context to that. If you remember, before McDaniels even got to Vegas, the Raiders had fired Gruden and had an interim head coach in Rich Bisaccia. The team ended up playing pretty decent after Gruden was gone, and everyone, including the people in the locker room, thought that Bisaccia should have gotten the head coach job, but instead they went with Josh McDaniels, and we all know how that went. So this time around, they weren't going to make the same mistake. They were getting a lot of pressure from the outside and also inside the locker room to hire this guy, so they just had to. With all that being said, I do think that Antonio Pierce was a panic hire. I think they were getting a lot of pressure and folded. I really don't think they got a serious chance to look elsewhere, and they were really just pressured based off of their past mistakes. So Antonio Pierce could end up being a good coach, but I'm just not exactly sure how this experiment's gonna fare. Like, I know the Raiders turned it around to an extent after Josh McDaniels left, but I'm more inclined to believe that the reason they did that was more so because they were playing with a fuck you attitude, and the problem was no longer in the building and Josh McDaniels than it being Pierce's coaching genius. Now, maybe I'm just being pessimistic. Maybe Pierce will end up being a good head coach. I mean, we've seen a lot of players turned into coaches lately, but it feels like the verdict isn't exactly out on if it's actually worked yet. I mean, Dan Campbell is probably the poster child right now, and honestly, I hope that Pierce is a good head coach. I mean, I would love if literally anybody could unseat the Chiefs as the top dogs in the NFL right now, and unfortunately for the Raiders, this is definitely not the year for them to do that. The Raiders aren't the best, but they certainly could string together some wins here or there and maybe find themselves in a decent spot by the end of the season, but I don't think it's that likely. So here's some really good news for the Raiders. The defense is good. When you think about the Raiders defense, you probably go right to Max Crosby, as you probably should. He's just fantastic, and he's been a force on that defensive line for a while now. Then you'd hopefully like to see a little bit more out of Tyree Wilson. He's the length edge guy from Texas Tech that the Raiders took 7th overall last year, but the Raiders did sign a huge addition in the offseason, bringing in Christian Wilkins, who's going to be huge at defensive tackle. That defensive line really should end up looking pretty solid. The corners are likely going to have to really man the secondary, but that'll probably be fun to watch. Jack Jones was good playing last year for Pierce, who was his old high school and college head coach. If you remember, the Patriots released him after a ton of drama. This is a guy that brought loaded guns into an airport, but that wasn't enough to release him. What really was the straw that broke the camel's back is that he broke curfew, because of course. Across from him, it's going to be Jacorian Bennett, and he had a really good rookie season, and hopefully we'll get to see him continue to develop. If this team has any amount of success this season, it's probably going to come on the shoulders of the defense. The defensive line, in my opinion, is like a top 10 unit in the league, especially if they can just stay healthy this season. Max Crosby is just so much fun to watch. This guy's a legit maniac, and he just turns it on when he steps onto the field. I really like the addition of bringing in Wilkins. Like, I loved him in Miami. He's a funny ass guy, and it helps that he's a pretty damn good football player. The defense, in my opinion, is likely a top half of the league unit, and because of that, I do think that they're going to be able to win some games this year. But the defense can really only do so much. If the offense can't move the ball, or they're turning it over all the time and they're just not scoring touchdowns, they're not going to win games no matter how good the defense plays. So yes, the defense should be good, but will the offense? Probably not. But of course, they do still have a dog in Davante Adams. And frankly, it really doesn't matter who's behind center for him. I mean, I could be behind center for the Raiders and he'd still somehow go for 1,000 yards. He's still definitely a top player in the league, and he's been good for the Raiders, even after leaving the mighty Aaron Rodgers. Adams is a stud, and I really like the number 2 that they have there too, Jakobi Meyers. Bro, I loved Jakobi Meyers. I loved him in New England. I thought that they were going to re-sign him, and no, they ended up giving the exact same contract that they could have given Myers to Juju Smith-Schuster. Yes, the guy that the Patriots just cut. I'm still not over it. I'll never be over it. But I love Jakobi, and I think he's a great number 2. The wide receiver core is definitely top heavy with Adams and Jakobi, but after them, it's returner Trey Tucker, who had 300 yards as a rookie. Tight end should be really fun to watch this season. They have 2 studs there. They took Michael Mayer in the 2nd round 2 years ago, and then they just took stud Brock Bowers 13th, who certainly has his own high expectations. At running back, Josh Jacobs is now a Packer, so it's going to be Zamir White and Alexander Madison, who I gotta say are probably going to have quite the time playing behind that offensive line. Left tackle Colton Miller is surely the best on the line, but an interesting guy to watch is Jackson Powers Johnson. He was an early 2nd round pick out of Oregon who's going to be playing guard, but we'll just have to wait and see if he's actually starting or not. This offense, simply put, just isn't that great. I mean, wide receiver's great with Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers, but everything else outside maybe tight end just isn't that great. The offensive line isn't that great, and that's going to be a big thing for both of the new running backs that he just added and whoever they throw behind center at quarterback. While I do think the offense will struggle, there are still some things to look forward to this season. Gardner Minshew is a fun watch, and it's going to be exciting to see how that tight end duo ends up working out. Brock Bowers has a ton of expectations coming into this season. That guy was just a dog at Georgia, so I'm really excited to see how all of his skills and talents translate over to the pros. This is a team that can definitely win some games this year. The defense is good, and the offense, well, not exactly the best, certainly isn't the worst. And the good news for the Raiders is really outside of the Chiefs, the AFC West is pretty unknown right now. Bo Nix might be the guy in Denver. I mean, we don't even really know there. And then you look over at the Chargers and they have a new head coach. So who knows how that's going to work in year 1. Those are 2 teams that are entering a new era, and the Raiders are in a similar spot. So if the Raiders can put it together, they might actually end up in a decent spot in the division. Now, I don't see that happening, but it's certainly a possibility. I really can't express enough my distrust in Luke Getsy. I don't like him. I think that he's overrated. This guy just sucked in Chicago, and I know he's in a different spot now, so maybe things will be different, but I don't believe in this guy. He's really only gotten to where he is now because he got to coach Aaron Rodgers. And first off, I hate that argument. I hate the argument of this guy should be a good coach because he coached Aaron Rodgers. That's just a stupid ass thing to say. Like, no shit, you succeeded with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL on your team. That's literally like saying that Josh McDaniels should have been a great head coach because he got to coach Tom Brady. Did that work out? No. So why do we think it's going to be any different with Aaron Rodgers coaches? Luke Getsy hasn't worked out really. Nathaniel Hackett certainly didn't work out in Denver. Like, these guys that are getting all this credit because they worked with Aaron Rodgers, maybe it was just Aaron Rodgers that was doing the heavy lifting. Just a stupid argument. Sorry for my rant. I just had to get that off my chest. But I do think because of that, the offense is going to struggle. Maybe he can have a bounce back year for his career with Gardner Minshew or Aidan O'Connell, but he was just rough in Chicago. And I think we're just going to see a lot of the same thing here. But at the end of the day, anything can happen. It's the NFL. But if I'm being really honest, I don't see this team doing anything too crazy this year.